Salutations, denizens of YouTube! If there's one thing the licensed LEGO games are known for, it's how many they've managed to pump out since 2005. But other than that, the most prominent part of each and every game is the studs. Studs are what make the LEGO world go round. They can be found all over the place, which can become quite a problem if you want to beat the game without touching a single one, for some reason. I guess just for the challenge of it. I don't know why I decided to do this. Well, I was partly inspired to make this video by all the videos of people doing no coin runs in Mario games. I thought, well, I don't play Mario, but I do have plenty of LEGO games, and studs are sort of like coins, so why not? I chose to do LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga, because I believe it is the best LEGO game out there, a classic really, so I knew I wouldn't mind playing the levels over and over again. So, beating the game without touching a single stud. Seems easy enough, right? Well, it got complicated fast. For one thing, studs have some kind of magnetic attraction to you, so you can never be completely sure if you can get around one. It's more a trial and error process. Even worse is how studs will sometimes just decide to collect themselves, and will add to the stud counter, even without you being close enough to touch the stud. I believe this might be a glitch because it's inconsistent. So, for the purposes of this video, I will define touching as this: performing the action of entering the coin's radius of collectability, where you will hear the sound of it being collected, and it will make its way towards the stud counter in the top corner of the screen. I have to define it this way because sometimes you will touch a stud that would normally enter the stud count, but you will exit the area and it won't actually be counted. For the purposes of this video, doing this actually counts, but the whole thing where studs just randomly collect themselves does not count. And no, dying and losing studs does not erase the studs you previously collected. That would be stupid. Now, there are some weird exceptions to these rules in certain levels, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And yeah, you could argue you never actually touch any studs because they get collected a bit of a distance away, but just for simplicity's sake, touching a stud means this. No need to overcomplicate it any more than I already have. As for what constitutes beating the game, I just mean completing every level in story mode. And since I am splitting this no studs challenge into two parts, this video will be just the 18 levels of the Prequel Trilogy. Part 2 will cover the 18 original trilogy levels. So, can you beat every level of Star Wars The Complete Saga without touching any studs? Let's find out. Kicking things off, Chapter 1 of Episode 1. I'll start by being more detailed, and in later levels we'll only talk about the trickier bits. After force opening the door, make sure to avoid the studs that explode out and wait for them to disappear. Avoid the studs in the hallway, and when you get here, be careful not to be standing in the way of the studs that come flying out when you force open the lever and when you build the panel thing. If TC-14 is standing dangerously close to the studs on the ground, you can move away and she will follow. This ensures that when you swap over to her, you won't collect any studs. The next section opens up and is pretty simple. Just make sure not to get the power up because it gives you stud magnet, and that's not good. After defeating the droidicas, there is a somewhat tricky jump to make it over this wall, but just jump towards the center and you're good. On to Chapter 2. This tank blows out studs surprisingly far, so look out for that. This line of studs after meeting Jar Jar is fairly easy to jump over. This jump over these studs gave me a bit of trouble, but the next section is much harder. It is possible to make it all the way through this area without getting a stud, but you have to jump perfectly. Use Jar Jar and jump on the side towards the camera most of the time. For this jump, hug the cliff instead. It'll definitely take a few tries to get all of it right. Now this next section, unfortunately, is even harder, and sadly it is impossible to get past without touching a stud. So it looks like no, it is not possible to beat LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga without touching a single stud. It's sad, we got so far. But I think just as interesting of a question is what is the minimum number of studs you have to touch to beat the game? So that is the question I will be answering for the rest of this video. And by minimum, I in fact mean the actual number of studs touched, not the value of the stud. Silver, gold, blue, purple, each are all equal to 1. Let's continue on with this new quest. It turns out that you have to touch 2 studs here. Jump here, and then swap over to a Jedi. You can't get them to move out of the way of the 2 studs, so when you swap, you will touch both studs. Then jump off the cliff when you force break the block thing. That's the only way to dodge all the studs that come flying out. There are some more impossible studs to miss in the next section. 3 here, and 1 on this platform. From there, it's smooth sailing. Chapter 3. The start here is pretty tricky. The game wants you to use this grapple, but that would result in 4 unavoidable studs. However, there is a glitch to the right where if you destroy this door and get right here, just jump up to the upper level without having to touch a stud. The next tough spot is here. Unfortunately, single jump characters cannot jump straight over a stud without touching it, so we have to get 4 studs here no matter what. The stud outside this window is unavoidable as well, but all of these on this ledge can be avoided. Skipping forward, and again, self-collecting studs do not count, the next unmissable stud is all the way at the end over this button you have to press. Chapter 4. Right out of the gate, I have to say this one is super annoying, but it is possible to beat without getting a stud. Each of these poles and these crystals causes some combination of studs valuing 1,000 to be collected, and I do count it as touching them because you are in fact hitting the pole or crystal. But as I said, you can go through all 3 laps without hitting anything. The poles are pretty easy to miss, but for the crystals, I recommend slowing down as much as possible. You can get through, but you might have to try a couple times on the last lap because you'll be so far behind first place that it is impossible to win the race. Chapter 5. You can get far into this mission without much trouble. This bridge is tricky, so just use R2 to fly around it. This part with Anakin is tough, but with some smart planning using R2 and Anakin swapping, and a perfect jump here, you can manage to avoid every stud. The rest of the level is easy after that. And Chapter 6. There's only one tough section, and boy is it annoying. I managed to get through it with 4 studs touched. I can't even count how many times I redid this section trying to get that number down. I honestly thought it was impossible to get lower than a 10 for a while. The rest of the level is super easy though. That puts the minimum stud count for episode 1 at 16 studs touched. Now episode 2, chapter 1. The tricky bits here are inside the shielded areas, but it's just a matter of patience and keeping your distance from the stuff you are blowing up. Not all that difficult overall, and an easy 0 stud level. Chapter 2. All these studs at the beginning can prove tough to get around, but it's possible. For these, you'll want to swap to R4 and fly over them. But here, we come to a truly monstrous sight. Absolutely horrifying. 12 unavoidable studs, all in the same area. But we have to move on, and the rest of the level is straightforward enough. Except for some reason going on the right side of these studs lets you pass, but the left side doesn't. Chapter 3. This level is a doozy. A nicely timed jump can get over these studs, and just go to the side to avoid all of these. For this part, kill the droideka, and then jump just right to get over all the studs. This press thing has 2 unavoidable studs if you jump perfectly. Then you have to hit one of these studs on the fan, and 2 on this ledge. There are 5 studs you can't miss at the top of this grapple, but at least you can shoot the other target from this side, meaning you can avoid all those studs on the right platform. Next, with the right pathing and some good R2 flying, you can avoid all the studs up to the R2 panel, where 3 are unavoidable. In this room filled with studs, you actually only have to touch 3. One is at the beginning so you can get close enough to spin the platform, and the other 2 are unavoidable when getting to the C-3PO panel. The studs in the middle area can be dodged by staying at the far edge of the platform. The last unavoidable stud is in front of the R2 panel near the end. So for the whole level, that is a total of 17 unavoidable studs, which is the most so far for one level. Chapter 4. This one is so easy to complete without touching a stud, I'm not even going to talk about it. Just use common sense and you'll be fine. Chapter 5. This one again is pretty easy to do without touching a stud. Sometimes studs will do that auto-collect thing, but they don't count because they should stay on the ground uncollected normally. I think it's a glitch. Pretty easy level, just a little tedious. Chapter 6. So far, this one is the easiest by a long shot. Just don't be an idiot and fall on these studs like I did. So for episode 2, the total number of studs touched is 29. Now for episode 3, chapter 1. This is the most troublesome level for my whole rule system that I came up with. Each red button you shoot results in 1,100 worth of studs being collected, but you aren't technically touching them. However, unlike in the other situations where you collect studs without touching them, this is actually intended and is not any sort of glitch. But since you are indeed not touching them, I would say these studs don't count. If they were to count, the minimum number for this level would be 22, since there are 11 buttons you have to shoot, and each of them can give you 1 blue and 1 gold stud. Chapter 2. About a fourth of the way into the level are the first unavoidable studs. These 2 here, and then these 2, and then these 3 in the fan, then these 2, and then these 3 in front of the R2 panel, and then these 2 as you exit. The next hard part is this running section. It's possible to avoid all the studs, but it's difficult. I would also recommend taping down the right stick on your controller so that the camera angle is better. This actually helps quite a lot. The next section again is pretty tricky. Put R2's flying skills to use and go around all the studs. Leave everyone else behind because you don't need them. You'll eventually have to use the R2 panel and must touch 3 studs. The rest of the level is easy after that. That's 17 total studs for the level. Chapter 3. There are just 2 studs you can't miss no matter what. Be careful around the rest and it's pretty easy. Chapter 4. You have to touch 2 studs on this bridge no matter what. It's impossible to jump between them. There are 4 you have to touch at the top of this grapple, 1 more here, and 4 here, and 4 more here. There are 2 more on this bridge, like before, that you have to touch. Here, if you are very skillful, unlike me, you can avoid all the studs. The rest of the level is straightforward after that, though I recommend using this walker to jump up and avoid these 2 studs. That means the level has a total of 17 unavoidable studs. Chapter 5. The first tricky stud is this one by these stairs, but a nice jump can dodge it. To avoid the single stud in front of these blocks, just move up slowly and carefully. This section with the 3 levers you have to pull is pretty tough, but with enough patience and perfectly executed jumps, you don't have to touch any studs for the first lever, 3 for the second, which is 1 on the platform and 2 to touch the button, and for the third lever, you only have to touch 1 stud. Chapter 6. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen, the last level of the Prequel Trilogy, and it just so happens to be the worst for avoiding studs. Right off the bat, you spawn in on a stud. And then comes one of the hardest sections so far, the lava run. After many tries, several broken controllers, and 2 shattered TVs, I can confidently say only 3 studs are unavoidable. These 3 at the end. I again recommend taping down the right stick of your controller so the camera has a better angle. You again spawn in on a stud in the next section, and there is another unavoidable stud. When you destroy these things, it seems like all the studs are unavoidable, but actually most of them are self-collecting studs, so they don't count. Just make sure not to touch any of the non-self-collecting ones. With some very careful jumping, you can dodge all the studs on this big platform. But on these little platforms, most of the studs are unavoidable. You'll end up collecting 18 in total in this section leading up to the final boss fight. That's a lot of studs. Quite unfortunate. That puts the total unmissable studs for episode 3 at 64. Adding all 3 episodes together, it comes out to 109 studs you must touch. That sadly is not 0 like I was hoping for at the beginning, but at least it's a fairly low number. Since I hadn't played the game in so long before making this video, I seriously thought you could beat it without touching 1 stud. But I was rudely awakened when I actually played the game again, and saw just how many studs there were all over the place. After my initial playthrough of the game, I thought the final number would be really high, somewhere around 400, but eventually I whittled that down to a pretty low number after finding optimal strategies. Maybe someone can come up with a better way and get a number even lower, but 109 seems pretty good to me. I just have to do the original trilogy levels next to get the total minimum number of studs for the entire game. So stick around for that video because it should be coming out sometime between when I release this video and the day after I release the original trilogy video. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and don't die, I guess.